of week 5 of this 2024 MLQ season. I am Keegan Remy Miller. I am filling in this week as host for Ethan Sturm. I'm joined by Naresh Adala and Jack McGovern to discuss this week's action. 4 really good series played in 2 different places. Series of the week up north where Toronto visited Detroit, and the South Super Series in Austin featuring New Orleans, Kansas City, and Austin. But before we start discussing those 2 series, I do want to point out we are now halfway through this MLQ regular season. So Naresh and Jack, I'm going to ask each of you, give me one thing that you're really excited about, you're surprised about. What's the big storyline coming out of the first half of this 2024 MLQ season? We'll start with you, Jack.
Yeah, I think for me, it's the strength and competitiveness of this South division that we're going to talk about today. I wasn't very high on this division coming into the season, and, we haven't seen them play other divisions. But it's clear from watching the film that there are some good things going on. Obviously last weekend, the big League City victory over the Austin Outlaws. We'll talk more about this later, but I think this was, a really nice bounce back performance from the Outlaws, showing that, they're still going to be title contenders in August. And, New Orleans, I feel like just continues to progress in many ways. San Antonio is perhaps, going to be right there with Austin. That's going to be a really good series. So I'm really excited about the South Division, and I think I think they're going to be the division to watch at MLQ Championships this year.
So I actually disagree with Jack in a lot of points. So first thing, to answer your question, Keegan, I think coming into this season, a lot of us thought or had these preconceived notions about the teams and or divisions that are going to perform really well. And obviously, Jack, you said how you weren't that high on the South, and now they're potentially switched for you. But for me, a lot of us, I think, really had 3 teams at the highest levels of potentially being the only title contenders, and that was New York, Chicago, and Austin. But halfway through the season, I'm really at a point where I don't really know that we have a true favorite for champs. I think Titans are still probably up there, but they have cracks in their system. Austin, they have cracks in their system. I know they bounced back, but even then, I wasn't as impressed by the film as sounds like you were. Chicago, they showed me a lot but they're also playing against a Minneapolis team that didn't look all that good. So how much are we taking away from that performance? And now we're seeing Detroit really put together a dominant performance, or not even dominant, just a potential performance that makes them look, with their trajectory, look a lot better going into the summers, to the end of the summer. So for me, I'm at a point where this is probably my favorite season of MLQ so far. I think the amount of parity we've obviously seen has been excellent. But I'm at a point where I don't know who the winner might be, and that's the part that's really captivating me. But I'm going to push back on slightly the quality of play that we've received the last couple of weeks with a lot of teams, and I think that's that's my storyline going into champs in about a month and a half or so.
All right, and I think to piggyback on kind of what both of you are talking about with parity in the league, last year, all 3 divisions were won by undefeated champions. New York didn't drop a game. Austin didn't drop a game, obviously, all the way through championships. And Chicago did not drop a game in the regular season. And this year, halfway through the season, San Antonio is the only undefeated team left, and they're only 3-0. They've only had the 1 series. So we'll be talking to Jackson Johnson later, I'm sure. They'll have something to say about if San Antonio is going to get through unscathed. But it would not surprise me now if there were no undefeated teams by the end of the regular season. But if you'd told me that 5 weeks ago, I never would have believed that. But with our takes there from the first half of the season, we are now going to go ahead and jump into our first series from this weekend. It was a matchup in Detroit featuring the Innovators and the Raiders. Detroit gets the sweep 3-0. I think if you just look at the final scores, it kind of looks like a traditional sweep. But watching those games, they were a lot closer, a lot later than I think the scoreboard might be telling us. So jumping in first, Naresh, do you want to talk a little bit about how maybe the games were a little bit closer on the field than the scoreboard appears?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the first game, I tuned in. It was during the middle of the South Super Series, and I was like, yeah, let's watch this. Two North teams really see what Detroit's about. And I started game one. It quickly was a blowout, and I was like, oh, maybe this is what Toronto's going to give us. And then game two started, and about 14, 15 minutes in, it's about a 1 or 2 score game. I was like, oh, what happened here? And unfortunately, I had to leave later that night, so I couldn't really watch the games live. But actually going back and like talking to a few people and watching the games, the biggest difference between games one and games two and three was the sheer fact that Toronto had more of their players and their head coach available for them to play with on in games two and three. And in terms of the X's and the O's, I think just the sheer fact that they had the ability to potentially see the high press that Detroit was able to throw at them, see a bit more passing that the Detroit attack had. I think being able to adjust for that potentially kept those games slightly closer. But obviously, towards the end, they were about close-ish until the 14, 15-minute mark, and then after that, it was I think the Detroit talent just won out. And
bit of Detroit's attack, obviously led by Freed, but I think well-rounded when you really dig into those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty simple drive and dish offense with Leo Freed just making great decisions throughout the game, and Detroit's wing chasers making really smart, well-timed cuts, kind of just posting up on the side hoops. Freed, converted some shots on the middle hoop, as he is inclined to do. But this was a methodical attack. It looks like Detroit, knew what they wanted to do and executed it, and Toronto was slow to respond, I would say. I had pretty high hopes for Toronto entering this series. Toronto had never, lost a series to Detroit. They, have only played 2 times. But recently in 2022, Toronto kind of edged out Detroit for that last spot at MLQ Championship. So I think this is a big.
Toronto, obviously the second place team out of the North last year. So to get a sweep like that is obviously a big morale boost early on in the season, especially after taking a game off defending champs Prowl. So your record is 4-2 into the season, and you've just seen the first place and second place teams out of your division last year. But Jack, you were talking a little bit about this drive and dish offense from Detroit. As I was watching some of these games, it really seemed like a video game almost. They were just spamming the same play over and over to that medium hoop. When they were attacking to the left, it was the far hoop from the camera. Toronto was running a 2-2 zone, and for some reason, the zone just was not picking up on that hoop. Do we want to credit Detroit with this? Do we want to say it's something Toronto should have picked up? Like, I guess I want to know, is this something positive moving forward, or is it just a weird thing from this series that we're probably not going to see again?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was definitely something Toronto should have picked up. A 2-2 zone, you're not guarding, space. You have to be attentive of the players around you. And I think too many times Toronto's, 2-2 zone defense was just caught asleep, unaware of players, making, pretty predictable cuts at, pretty predictable times. And so, all credit to Detroit for taking advantage of that opportunity. But, I will be excited to see what Detroit can do when they face, a defense that's a little bit, faster on their feet and making quicker rotations. I thought, Toronto would often post up their beater behind the hoops. That's not really sufficient to cover the area behind the hoops. Your chasers have to be, making those rotations and have to be, monitoring what's going on behind them as well in an effective 2-2 zone. So I think that's something that the Raiders, when they go to the film, are going to see, and maybe they've already talked about heading forwards as a clear area for improvement.
yeah, I mean, oh, real quick, Keegan, I'm sorry. Just like bouncing off of what Jack was saying, I thought the fact that they placed it really looked to me that they put their beater right next to the medium hoop area, almost as if they wanted the beater to cover that space, potentially that area to protect against those cutters. But I think, as Jack was saying, oftentimes because that beater, they'd be stuck in that spot, or they'd have to be uh, forced to go after ball carrier. That space just opened up, and the person who was often in the 2-2 zone responsible for that specific space, they were planted at tall hoop every single time. Every single time the ball went through that hoop in the medium hoop because of a cutter, that person at tall hoop was just standing there. And I think one, that's a combination of the Detroit offense. I don't want to take away anything from what Detroit did, because I think there was one play specifically that I'm thinking of was Freed was up top, passed it to Margulis. Margulis took space, passed it off to a cutting Kagan, who then took space. Now, this is when you take space, you're freezing the defender, because if they're not closing out, if they close out at you, you have space behind it. You have space behind them to throw it, or you're potentially just able to rip the shot. And so the Toronto defender just was frozen, and that allowed so much space because the defense just never made up their mind. And I think when you have a defense that's very stagnant like that, that form of taking space and moving the ball in motion will cripple any defense. And I think that's what we saw. And I think that's just what a lot of Detroit offense was when they were really doing good stuff in their set offense. That's what we saw a lot of. So I think it's not, this isn't a, they just spammed it because it was working. It was, this looks like what they want to do going forward. And if this is the type of offense we're getting from Detroit, I'm very excited to see what they could do against a potential Minneapolis defense or any team they see at champs.
And so I think another thing that we saw a lot of in this series was transition plays. A lot of transition stops, a lot of transition goals. I'm wondering if either of you have thoughts about whether or not that is which team was happier to do the running. I think they were about even in goals. It certainly felt that way. But with Detroit scoring more goals throughout this series,
Yeah, I mean, I think Toronto's historically been, a very good transition team. Players like Brian Melchior who've excelled in transition. I do think, it was something that Detroit, wanted. I mean, they were coming out with the high press in this game, preventing, Toronto from just getting into an easy, half court offense. I think, there are a lot of half like transition moments that Detroit created. So I would guess the Innovators, looking at their beaters, looking at the physicality that they bring, were also, pretty comfortable, at least forcing Toronto to try to beat them in transition. I think that Toronto definitely had, moments of success in transition, getting around that high press as the series went on. But I think on net, it was a positive for Detroit. And again, something that Toronto has seen before. The Rochester Whiteout did it effectively against the Raiders in 2022. The Admirals at times, did it against the Raiders last season at champs. So, I think that the Raiders, were somewhat prepared, but I think that they should, be expecting to see that look again, because I don't think they've completely solved it.
And I think coming off of that, Naresh, I'm going to throw it right back to you. Something you were just talking about, Toronto's defense, where they looked a little bit flat, not moving great on defense. They weren't picking up Detroit's cutters. Do you want to talk through maybe? It feels like Toronto should be able to fix that, right? If they're a good transition team, they like to run, they know how to make tackles. It feels like speed shouldn't be an issue. It feels like fast twitch shouldn't be an issue on defense. Is this just a mentality thing, or does this need to be like a full coaching redesign for this Toronto half court defense?
Yeah, I think a lot of us often get sucked into this aspect of having the most complex system to run defenses, the really best strategies, phenomenal X's and O's. And I think with that, you lose a lot of just basic fundamentals. And I've said this to any team that I've coached, basic fundamentals will win you games. And especially in this league where you're still seeing at the highest levels drop passes, missed throws, it's honestly gotten to a point where if you just play with fundamentals, you'll win games. And I think that's where I go back into, if you're for a team that's as transition heavy as they want to be, their transition attempts weren't that crisp. in terms of if it was just Melchior trying to run through everyone, absolutely. He had some success with it. But there was also moments where Detroit was a very hard-hitting team. They were able to bring down Melchior, and now he has to get the ball off to his teammates, and it was either a bad pass or, and again, I don't mean to sound like I'm picking on Melchior specifically, but if you're going to be a transition-heavy team, you need to be able to get good, crisp passes off to be able to set up your teammates for success. And I think with Toronto, if they want to continue to be a transition heavy team and use the power and strength and ability to fill spaces that they have, they need to be able to make these passes more crisp. Because I just saw too many drop balls and too many loopy passes. And in transition, speed kills. And if you're letting the ball in the air that long, it's you're not going to have that much success.
All right. So looking beyond this series a little bit, let's stay focused on Toronto for just one more second. Obviously, we talked about a little bit earlier. Last year, they were second place in the North Division. Obviously, it was the six-team North Division. They faced off against the Chicago Prowl in the North Division champs. Came up short in that, but it did give them an automatic bid to the quarterfinals at championships. Now they've been swept by Detroit. Detroit lost the series to Chicago. Is Toronto now already planning we're going to be in the play-in? And if you think that might be the mentality in the coach's room, is this something where now the rest of the regular season doesn't really matter? We swept Cleveland. Let's make sure that we are as good as we can be in Howard County. Or is this next team up is Chicago? Let's game plan Chicago. After that, let's game plan for Minneapolis to end out the season. We'll throw to Jack on this one.
Yeah, I think that Minneapolis series should really be circled on the calendars of the Toronto Raiders. I mean, the Prowl series is a chance to, work on some things, especially, playing around a high press. I agree with Naresh that, there were some fundamentals like issues that kept popping up. But I think it's, achievable for the Raiders to figure out how to beat that kind of that pressure. And the Minneapolis Monarchs, looked vulnerable, frankly. And I think the Raiders will be excited for that matchup because there is a difference between that third seed and the fourth seed. So, do I think it's likely that the Raiders end up in the play-in bracket? Yes. But I think they still have a lot to play for in the regular season in terms of seeding and getting, the best possible matchup that they can to make a run in the play-in bracket.
Naresh, anything to add on that for Toronto moving forward?
For Toronto, I mean, as Jack was saying, I think suddenly this Toronto versus Minneapolis series becomes extremely fascinating because as much as we are, or at least me, I don't want to speak for y'all, but as much as I was almost, I know I'm harping on a lot of the negatives that Toronto had. Let's be honest, they still were within a goal or two by the 15-minute mark in games 2 and 3 when they had their full roster. And that was against a Detroit team that we're all very much high on. So if that's the Toronto team that can figure it out in a few weeks from now when they go into this Super Series? Yeah. Again, no. I'm sorry. When they go up against Minneapolis, I think this is a team that's very much in the running to make this Minneapolis series extremely contentious. And if Minneapolis goes in, there's a chance that Minneapolis, who fought through the play-in bracket last year, could end up in the play-in bracket again. This time as potentially a 4. So I'm very interested to see how this shapes up going forward in the North.
So you can circle it on your calendar, August 3rd, the last regular season week of MLQ this year. And crucially, Minneapolis is traveling to Toronto. So Toronto will be defending home turf. We know it's a lot easier in some of these divisions to be the home team. It's a lot easier to have a full roster for those. So really, really briefly, because we do need to move on to the South Division, I do want to just ask kind of the same question for Detroit. They knocked off last year's number 2. They stole a game from Chicago. They have only played one game in a quarterfinal in MLQ, according to my database, in 2015, the inaugural season. What do we think their ceiling is? It seems like they're going to get to the quarterfinal, but do you think Detroit has real aspirations to get past that round? I guess, Naresh, you start.
Yeah, I mean, I am very excited to see what this Detroit team can do and continue to go forward. I think their athleticism shows on the field, and I think more importantly, they have a plan of attack of what they want to do. I even said it last week where you're getting two factions of teams almost, the teams that are willing to move into spaces and the teams that are a bit more flat-footed while catching the ball. And I think this Detroit team is very much the former. They want to be moving. They want to be using their speed and their athletic ability to be able to get those cuts, take those space, and find the open passes. And you can do that when you have the athleticism that they do. And specifically, just shout out to Gwen Pratt and Lindsey Smyers, who are both genuinely phenomenal players that I've been super high on ever since I saw them play last year. But both players, especially on the defensive end, and offensive end. Gwen Pratt defensively was locked down, unafraid of contact, absolutely a star player. And then Lindsey Smyers making all the right decisions on offense was truly excellent to see. So this team has, and again, that's not even including the Brady Sowers, the Nick Loves, who we're actually going to talk to in a few minutes. And obviously, that's not even including Leo or Ryder Freed. And there's so many other players. They'd even have Julian this past weekend. So I think this team, depth-wise, has so much talent, and I can't wait to see how they piece it together for champs.
Naresh, you didn't answer the question. One word. Are they moving on to the semifinals or not?
Yes.
All right, Jack, and we'll go to you, and then we'll come to Nick.
Oh, that's such a hard question. I'm so high in this Detroit team. I think, this is a totally different team. That 2015 MLQ championships, every team made the quarterfinals. This Detroit team is going to qualify, for the quarterfinals, I think, and they will have earned it. This is a very talented team. I think it'll be matchup dependent, but yeah, I like their chances. I'm excited to see what they can do.
All right. Well, coming in on that high note, we'd like to introduce our first interview of the day, Nick Love from the Detroit Innovators. Nick, welcome. Happy to have you. We've obviously now been talking about your team for 5 or 10 minutes, mostly positive things. First question to you: how are vibes kind of around the team right now? Obviously, you get a game against Chicago, you get the whole series against Toronto. What's the feeling like in camp right now?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. I think the vibes are great right now. Obviously, we go to Chicago, we take a game off them, and especially just considering the culture that we're trying to build in Detroit now, it's a great feeling. And so going into this Toronto series, trying to come out with a sweep, going to get the sweep. Obviously, we have good plays, bad plays, things that we want to continue to work on. But moving towards like our Super Series versus Cleveland and Minneapolis, like vibes are extremely high. And still trying to workshop a lot of things that we're trying to work on. So vibes are great right now.
Nick, thanks so much for joining. Can you talk to me about that culture that you guys are trying to build? Like, what are kind of the hallmarks of it? Like, what do you guys talk about as being really important, as a team?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with just like how we practice in general, our mentality coming into practice and then preparing for series. Last year, it was a lot of this was the two or three plays that we have, and this is what we're going with. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, we'll see what happens. Versus having a lot more flexible offense and flexible defense and how we continue to prepare, and looking at the film and how our team preparing and what are the different things that teams are doing or tend to do and their tendencies and how are we going to react to that and play to our strengths as well. And so I think it's just an entire like culture and mentality about how we're attacking and preparing for games so we can be like the most successful.
Nick, hello, welcome. Thank you so much again for coming on. I remember first watching you play against Creighton in that Great Lakes Regional where you absolutely popped off on the film. And I just remember being like, who is this kid? And then I didn't see you at Knights Cup that year, but then again, I saw you at Nationals. And again, you popped every single time I watch you play. You shine on the field. And that was the same thing this past weekend where you looked very good being that off-ball cutter, filling players that might not have gotten a lot of name recognition last year or with their college teams, club teams. Now they're being talked about a bit more. How do you temper those expectations going into the next few weeks and especially at champs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to be honest, we just want to win. It's not really expectations of oh, we're gonna sweep this team, or like we want to get two off of this team. Like I think it's just more so like sticking to our strategy to put us in the best position to win at the end of the day. The recognition will come when we win games, and so it's not necessarily about trying to get highlight reels or trying to like stuff the stat sheets. Like we just want to go out there and do the best that we can and do what's ever possible for us to be able to get that win at the end of the day.
So I think that actually kind of leads me into a question here that you could give us a little bit of an insight into about how Detroit's operating right now. A lot of teams I've noticed in this sport like to game plan for other teams. These are their tendencies. This is what their beaters like to do. We're going to attack them by doing this. We're going to run our zone because this is how their offense works. And there's other teams that are just like, nah, we're going to win. Like we're going to play. They're going to match to us. We are going to set the tone. How would you describe Detroit? Do you think Detroit fits into one of those two categories right now?
I would probably say we're breaking into a third category of a little bit of both. We obviously come in with our game plan. They'll know like, oh, we're going to be a little bit more high tempo this game. And we're going to put pressure on the other team to play into our system. But if you guys are going to be in this 2-2 defense and you guys want to shade a little bit more towards middle hoop, we're going to make that cut on the right. And if it's there, we're going to abuse it until you continue to fix it. And so I think it's being a lot more flexible, but also setting what we want to do as our game plan as well.
Nick, talk to me about what you guys did on defense this series. Looked like a high press. Was that something you guys had been workshopping in practice? Seemed to work pretty well. What do you credit the success of that to?
Yeah, I think going into the series, it wasn't necessarily a high press that we were intended to do. Those opportunities really just came to us. If the beater isn't in the play, we're going to take advantage of that and just taking advantage of the opportunities that come to us. I think a lot of it just had to do with letting Toronto run their offense to benefit our defense so we can get a lot of picks off and create those press opportunities. But when those high press opportunities presented themselves, we definitely took advantage to see if we could get transition offense for sure. Thank you. Hope to see you there too.
All right. So next up, South Super Series held down in Round Rock, Texas. Of course, Austin Outlaws hosting that one. New Orleans Curse and Kansas City Stampede coming in. I think expectations coming in were all over the place. Obviously, Austin had dropped the series to League City the week before. They had back-to-back weekends. NOLA had already taken a series off of League City, so I think a lot of people were like, how's this going to work out? And then, of course, Kansas City, I think, coming into this weekend was kind of the wild card in the South. A really young team, sometimes questionable when they travel just because their distance is so far. But when all is said and done, Austin comes out 6-0. I think assuaging some people's fears that, or maybe hopes for some folks that it was a new Austin. And meanwhile, New Orleans and Kansas City do split a series with New Orleans coming out 2-1 on top. So we're going to interview Jackson Johnson here at the end of talking about this. So we're going to keep Austin to the end and open up on this New Orleans Kansas City series. All right. Big picture questions coming out of this. Kansas City wins the game day 2 after New Orleans won both games day 1. Do we think that came down to a coaching adjustment, or was it just that it's the way that it worked out and kind of the first 2 games were up in the air as well? And we'll go to you, Naresh, to start this one.
Yeah, I am very interested to see what Kansas City shows up to pretty much, sounds like each day at this point. Because let's take a quick trip back down memory lane, maybe like 3 weeks ago when it was San Antonio, Kansas City. And I very much thought Kansas City was the better team. I thought their offense was structured. They had an idea of what they wanted to do. And unfortunately, yeah, we all know what happened at the end of game 1, and they ended up blowing the lead. They lost the game. But I was excited. I was like, game 2 and game 3, if they play like this, they very much have a shot at winning this. And while they were hanging out and relatively close in each game, they never could pull it through because of a lot of just undisciplined, I'd say, in terms of their shot taking, their forcefulness in rushing an offense. And I think that's what we saw a lot of games 1 and 2, and pretty much all of day 1 for Kansas City, where it felt like they were just trying to make plays when they weren't there. And I think that was the difference between games 1 and 2 on Saturday and then game 3 on Sunday, where and again, it wasn't a perfect fit, but on Sunday, I very much saw a team that was a lot more structured. I saw a team that was a bit more disciplined, and I just saw a team that was able to find those open passes and just take advantage of the ability for them to hit shots versus previously they were just trying to rip shots or trying to force passes when they just weren't there. It was a tale of two halves almost for this Kansas City team. But I think one thing that was fairly consistent for nearly every single game this past weekend was how deadly and dominant this Kansas City team can be during stitch on pitch. And I think a large part of that starts with their ability to be physical, and whether that's Jackson Herdade, Ryan Mejio, Lawrence Smith, Blitzy Archibald, and Anya. Pretty sure it was Anya Ortiz. That were all able to continue play and get those open runs and make those cuts. And I think this team during flag runner on pitch is absolutely deadly. But they need to be able to get there consistently with a lead and or relatively close enough to the lead. And that'll be, I think, the difference maker for them going forward.
So I actually wanted a lot more physicality from Kansas City on offense. I think, there's a Creighton core to this team. Perhaps not as big of a Creighton core as, we had been expecting, heading into the season. No Rally Usami yet. But players like, Ryan Mejio, who I think has, been holding up his end of the bargain, challenging, experience and chemistry, really paid dividends in this series, and Kansas City's, lack thereof, was apparent. And just, being the younger team, New Orleans looked like the stronger and more physically imposing team throughout this series. I thought, their rotations on defense were quick, and they would meet the opposing ball carrier, and initiate the contact as the defender. Kansas City players, I thought, were too often caught flat-footed on the receiving end of a tackle instead of gathering some steam, and being dictating the terms of the contact by initiating it. So I think, in terms of half court offense, I thought New Orleans really beat them there. As the series went along, perhaps like this kind of young core of Kansas City missing a few key pieces, was able to figure some more things out. But it's hard playing against a cursed team that has years and years of experience playing together. I thought it showed.
Yeah, I'm gonna slightly push back there with I think New Orleans, for the most part, day one did show up and they looked a bit more put together than Kansas City. But I honestly wasn't really impressed by New Orleans that much either. Mostly because one, I think at this level we're at a point where dropped passes should not be a thing, right? Like, yeah, occasionally you're gonna fumble a ball, sure, but consist lies on one pass trying to use their ability to jump really high or potentially just cut into space and look for that one pass. I think that's where they often get stuck. And I think that's what we saw in game 3 when New Orleans couldn't really fight through the adversity, unlike the previous days, where previous days a large part of it was Kansas City not performing well, but New Orleans was still able to get some easy goals off because of their ability to move the ball. But in game 3, they got 2 goals off of a Ben Mertens to Nick Mueller alley-oop to the medium hoop that worked twice. But then Kansas City switched to a 1-3 zone, and then you just did not see them score after that. And I think the rest of the game, the score at that point was, I think, 7-6, and the rest of the game they only scored twice because Kansas City City outscored them by 105-20, right? That sort of thing where you're often getting stuck relying on one pass is where, for me, I'm concerned about this Curse team. For as much chemistry that they do have with certain players, I do know that they're incorporating a lot of younger talent and younger players that haven't played as much into the fold. So I'm pretty sure as we get closer to champs, that'll get taken care of. But the one consistent thing I've seen from this Curse team is drop balls, missed catches, and surprisingly a ton of cards, which cost them dearly in a lot of the games that they've played this past weekend. But yeah, so I just wanted to quickly push back on that. But with Kansas City specifically, I think while the structure is there, they just need to be able to do it consistently. And as Jack, you said, if that chemistry can come together, again, not just Riley Usami, they were missing Matty Nemeni this weekend, who played huge minutes for them against San Antonio. And so that's one of those things where if they can put together and be consistent with the output that they produce, I think there's not another team that can really match the athletic ability that they possess 1 through 30.
So I think coming out of that, and obviously missing some key pieces, that's never a good thing when half of your regular season is being played in one weekend. Kansas City's now 1-8. They have a series against League City left to end out the year. I think coming into the season, if you'd said Kansas City needs to sweep League City to get into champs, you would have said, okay, well, League City's not going to go to champs and Kansas City is. I don't think that's the case anymore. So are we looking at a Kansas City team that maybe it's too little too late? Or do they still have a shot here being down 1-8? I'm not sure the exact math they're going to need, but with Austin and Kansas City already stamping their bids into championships, it's really all or nothing now for Kansas City. So, Jack, what do you think about this? Is it too little too late, or can they kind of come out of this? Do they have the pieces? They just need to put it together.
Yeah, I mean, they'll have the opportunity to prove themselves against League City, but I think you're right. I mean, this was not supposed to happen. This Kansas City team was supposed to have arrived, with their run through bracket play last year, and I think what this season is showing us is just the importance of key players on the roster. And how much time it takes to really build a contender, especially in a much improved division. So I don't think anyone was expecting the South Division to be this competitive this season, for League City to look so sharp and fine-tuned, organized on both defense and offense. So Kansas City will have more film now. They can go back and try to work with the pieces that they have, but it's going to be an uphill battle. League City has a lot to play for too. So I'm afraid in a very tough division, they might be the odd team out.
Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same boat with Jack. I think we're at a point where you never want to be a team that's relying on other teams to do something for you to get to your end goal. We always want to be in control of our own destiny. And I think with Kansas City now, you're really, really hoping that League City doesn't take a game from San Antonio next week, because now things get a lot iffier. But I think the one thing that really gave them a shot is the fact that they won one game from this past weekend, because now even if League City gets a game from San Antonio, suddenly League City needs to travel up to Kansas City, where non-Austin record, Kansas City is 11-2 at home, which is remarkable, right? So I think they're hoping that either League City doesn't get a win at all, which is probably the best case for them, because then they would just need to win the series and then be fine. Or if League City gets a win from San Antonio, now they would need to sweep League City at home, which is very much doable based on what League City is able to travel with. And so that's where things become a lot more interesting. And I think this South Division in particular this year, I think has been absolutely fascinating. And so I'm very, very excited to see what Kansas City ends up doing going forward.
August 3rd is going to be a busy, busy day for MLQ fans. So after you're done with that Toronto-Minneapolis series, keep it on the MLQ Network. And as Naresh just said, that's going to be League City traveling up to Kansas City with everything to play for, most likely, to close out the season. That'll be 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. So kind of setting up a really interesting finale to the season and gives Kansas City a few weeks to really game plan for this series, and they know what's on the line. Kind of moving back towards New Orleans, Naresh, you've already given some thoughts specifically kind of about their passing game is maybe lacking a little bit. Jack, I want to throw it over to you. Big thoughts out of New Orleans. Obviously, 2 series wins this year, and they are one of the first 2 teams already qualified for champs. So obviously, they want to look good going up towards Howard County. But really, at this point, regular season could just be a tuning ground for them.
Yeah, I'm much higher on New Orleans than Naresh. I think they've really continued this upward trajectory that we've been seeing the past couple seasons. I think they use what they have really well. So they have a lot of height. One thing they do is they play above the rim. They're throwing their passes purposefully high. They're using those height advantages around the hoops. And then I can't say enough about their beating game. I think Josh Mansfield had a terrific weekend. Alex Bucciarelli has been super solid all season long. We're still I believe waiting on stats from the New Orleans beaters, but I expect when they come out that they're going to look pretty good, especially against Kansas City. So I think this New Orleans team really knows who they are. And, there are times when, against League City, that last game, where, towards the beginning of the season, they're still kind of figuring some things out, but that's normal, I think. Teams, take some time to gel, even teams that have been, playing together.
They were my team since last year. That what they did last year with 12 people being in my opinion, they were the most strategically sound team, taking advantage of every opportunity they got. I am a huge Curse fan. That's why I want better, because I know what this team can do. They showed what they could do last year. So I want them bettered. I want these, and again, I hear you about playing above the rim, being able to use that height. I mean, we're going to interview Jackson in a few minutes, but there was a play in that series where Jackson Johnson tried to poster PJ Mitchell. That did not go well for Johnson, right? And so their defense, their size is absolutely unbelievable. But I think when you get caught up in the fact that, oh, we are bigger than these people, we are taller, like high, like we can jump higher. I think if you start getting into those type of conditionals, you start playing less fundamental. And I think my biggest thing for this entire MLQ replay, whether it's Toronto, Detroit, because again, even Detroit, as much as we were high on them, they were dropping a ton of balls as well, right? To contact and throwing the ball away, or can't just hit a pass. And right. So that's where things are just like iffy for me, but I'm a huge Curse fan. I'll have you know.
All right. Everybody now knows that Naresh Adela is a huge fan of the New Orleans Curse. He'll be rooting for them over in Howard County. But with that, let's talk about the one team that went 6-0 on the weekend, Austin Outlaws. Obviously, last weekend, I think literally the episode opened on, is this the biggest upset in the sport's history? I left a lot of question marks coming into this week. 6-0, a few close games, but I'd say in the end, no really big scares. So Jack, what are we thinking about Austin? Are they back to being Austin, or are they maybe just painting over some of the cracks that League City exposed?
Yeah, I think heading into this series, a lot of people were wondering, would the real Austin Outlaws please stand up? And I think we got an emphatic answer from the Outlaws. I think they're back. They're not as deep as last year's team, but I saw them, problem solving this weekend in a very short, period of time. So, on offense in the chaser game, one thing I saw them doing really effectively was using those wide spaces, using the wings, hunting mismatches, putting their chasers in a position to beat defenders one-on-one. As opposed to, trying to force everything, right down the middle, like you might see from, Josh Johnson, for instance, in years past. So, great performance from Jay Stewart, 13 goals, Luis Sanchez, 11 assists. The Beaters, this was a tough assignment. And they had a really good weekend. The stats show, the Austin Beaters, Cameron Castlewa was +8, Casey Beavers and Taylor Tracy were +5. I thought they both, had, really excellent weekends. So, I think, this Austin team is still very dangerous. We'll see how they look against San Antonio. That's going to be, their toughest, test, in the South Division. We think, unless, it turns out League City, shocks the Soldados too. But the Austin is going to have a challenge there. But I expect them to be the favorites in that series. Even given the hiccup in week 1.
Okay, so I think the biggest difference between last week versus this week was just the fact that they won a few more games. That might sound wild to say, right? Like that you might be like, hey, that makes no sense. I agree with you. But in my head, what I'm seeing is Austin still had a lot of cracks, I think is what I'm going to say, right? And I think you said, oh, they, for the most part, they never had a scare. I disagree. New Orleans games 1 and 2, they were both, I think New Orleans needed 2 goals to win in both games. And one, John Alvarez clutched them out for Austin multiple times this series, not just the series, this weekend. Or they were able to finish the game, which was great, right? But they had scares. They never were able to, quote unquote, put away a team, especially day 1. And I think that was the most telling. Kansas City, Austin, when I think it was 5-5 at 20 minutes. And for as low as we were on Kansas City, if you're playing 5-5 at 20 minutes, that's where things are like, wait a minute. So I think there's still a lot of, I don't want to say issues, but it's not the most complete Austin performance that we have come to expect. So I think I'm going to slightly push back on the fact that I think let me slow down. I'm going to push back on the fact that Austin is back. I think they weren't really challenged by any of the teams this weekend in a way that League City did a week ago, right? We saw, and we talked about League City's offense. It was crisp. It was everyone touched the ball. Everyone was able to get involved in plays, which is 2 things that we've specifically talked about with Kansas City and New Orleans, where oftentimes with Kansas City, it was their offense was unstructured. With New Orleans, it was they were often relying on one pass. That's not how you're going to beat Austin. And for Austin, I think they really, again, they got a few more wins, but in terms of, this is something I like to talk about, focus on the process, not the outcome. If you're looking strictly at the outcome, yes, Austin's back 6-0, clinched the South Division to go to champs. Great job. But in terms of the process, I don't know. I think there's still a lot of holes with what they are trying to do. I think it looked better. I think there were moments that definitely looked pretty solid, and it's definitely the team that we've come to expect. But now they have to piece it together for a more dominant performance, the 1 through like 25 minutes of game time. So that's where I'm at.
I mean, Naresh, I think I would push back a little bit on this just because they had to play back-to-back weeks. They came off a loss, and then to go 6-0 without having a weekend practice in between. I don't know if they had a weekday practice. Obviously, we could ask Jackson in a few minutes here, but I think in general, in developing, and frankly, they've given themselves a shot to win the entire South Division still. So before we go to Jackson, I do want to ask one more question. We'll go to you, Jack. I guess just based on what I was just talking about, how big of an accomplishment is it to be able to lose 2 games for the first time in a regular season ever, not get 5 days, and then you go 6-0? Obviously, you could argue it's a little bit lower of a competition, but I guess you would. I'm just asking for your opinion on like how impressive is this to turn that around?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's very impressive because, I mean, think of the pressure. I mean, a lot was impressive and shows kind of some of the character of this team. And even though they haven't really, experienced this kind of adversity in terms of regular season losses or even, Benepy Cup losses the past 3 years, yeah, they were able to respond, within a short amount of time. So, I give credit to some of the returners. I think Sammy Garza and Mel Kite, both helped to provide some of that connective tissue for the offense to keep the ball moving. They were sorely missed against the Legends. But the Stars also stepped up for sure. So yeah, like I mentioned, Jay Stewart, in the limelight, scoring, all those goals, winning all those matchups. Definitely caught my eye.
All right, thanks for that, Jack. We are now going to jump to our second interview of the day, head coach of the Austin Outlaws, Jackson Johnson. Jackson, thank you for joining us. It's been an eventful 10 days or so for you and your team. Obviously, the upset loss to League City, followed by a 6-0 weekend. First of all, congratulations both on the 6-0 and on qualifying for championships. But secondly, can you just walk us through, I guess, what the last 10 days have been like in terms of, vibes in the group chat, what the coaching staff is thinking about, all those sorts of things?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having me on the show. It was a tough week after dropping the series to League City, not gonna lie. Group chat was pretty quiet. But, I think we, as a team, didn't think we quite put in the effort that we needed, didn't have the effort and focus there that weekend. And a lot of that's on me for not getting the team mentally prepared on site early enough for the League City series. But, just knowing that, not to overreact as a group and to come in this weekend and being confident that, we're good players, maybe we didn't execute to, what we expect, but, have faith in your game still. We got the jitters, the worst that, and in our head that could have happened already. So we got nothing to lose. Just go out there and play.
And real quick before I throw it to Jack and Naresh, were you able to have like a weeknight practice, or is it just fully League City's done? We'll do some film in the chat, and then it's next up to the Super Series.
So we did do a film study on Thursday night, and then a big problem for our League City series is we kind of showed up a little too late, and we kind of got rushed into the series, which again, that's my bad as a coach, not getting us prepared. So we got there early to Round Rock for the Super Series, walked through a couple things that were glaring issues in the film, just to make sure everyone understood hey, we got to do this if we want to win this weekend. So we just went through that and then continue on as normal.
Yeah, Jackson, if you might let us in a little bit, like what were some of those focus points for the team, on the field, heading into the weekend? Like, was it just, we're gonna, get our full roster back, we have, our pieces, or were there like kind of specific things that you were focusing on doing on the field?
So specifically, the big things we weren't doing was basically flying out on our 2-2 zone, and when we send a beater out behind the hoops, we weren't locking up the pass options. We're creating this tough situation for the opposing ball carrier, but we're not capitalizing on it. In the other places of our defense. So we're trying to look for those opportunities, trying to jump passes a little better, and then just valuing the ball on offense. Such an easy thing to say, it's harder to do sometimes, right? So just hammering that point home. I think I missed the other part of your question there, but
yeah, I mean, I was also wondering about the impact of the players who you got back. So I mentioned Sammy Garza, Mel Kite, a couple others. How big was it to have them back?
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. I mean, this isn't the same Outlaw team of the years past. Our trajectory is different. I think I counted 15 new players on this year's 30-person roster. Uh, and, having Sammy, Bailey, Mel, Jenna out for that League City series, not to have an excuse. I mean, League City did everything they did. They deserve all the credit. But, I mean, that's like the inner circle of a group of players that have been playing for 8 years together, or something like that. Right. So helping delegate the tasks, helping run lines, helping keep the bench cool. Mel and Jenna specifically are like the loud ones on the team. If you know me personally, I'm very quiet, and I'm not going to sit there on the sidelines and cheer really loud. So just having people out there on our team like giving us a pulse and like bringing the energy up is, I think, huge for us. And just having that veteran leadership and helping notify me of maybe adjustments that I'm not seeing that we need to make. We kind of didn't have that in the League City series, and so getting that back and kind of getting all on the same page for the Super Series was huge for sure.
Jackson, thank you so much for hopping on tonight. I think a big talking point, especially this season so far, has been the fact that you're almost exclusively chasing. Can you confirm that the addition of Jay Stewart is why that is so? And if not, what is the choice, or why did you want to chase this specific summer? Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, obviously want to play with Jay Stewart. It's a lot of fun. I think he probably wanted to play with the beater version of me more than the keeper version of me. But I mean, this beater core on Outlaws we're deep. I mean, I think actually half of our roster is beaters or people that play beaters. Right. And, a good chunk of them, Taylor, Cameron Ogilvy, Kaiser, Casey, I mean, they were on that 2021 Outlaws team that won. I didn't play that year, so I mean they've won a championship. That core group. I mean, we bring in Maya, a club player. She's been great, and then Cameron Castelaw has come into her own the last couple of years. So just wanting to give our beater core the space to grow, and also keep things interesting for me as well. I've played for 11 years exclusively as a beater, so it gets a little boring. I don't have as much personal goals to work towards, so I wanted to kind of learn and grow in a different aspect of the sport. And I think I bring something different to the table than our other chasers, and just kind of using myself as a utility player kind of lets us dig into our depth a little bit more. I could help the chasers from taking so many tackles and hits and eating so many minutes as well, and then also give the beaters some space to grow and develop and play and take over in their own right.
So we asked kind of a similar question to Nick Love from Detroit earlier on tonight. I think instead though of saying, obviously, right, defending champs, but as you said, half of your roster has turned over. And at some point, you almost say, "Are you really defending champs anymore?" If all the players are new, it's just the name on the jersey that's the same. Did you have discussions as a coaching staff or as a team at the start of the season? Is it just still the goal is championship until it's not anymore, or is the goal South Division champs and championship, or I guess kind of like what are the goals that the Austin Outlaws have this year?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have a team if the goal wasn't just team. We have this expectation that the community kind of puts on Outlaws. They expect us to put up scores like we did last year, which I don't know if that's that's not a very easy thing to do. We're a pretty deep team last year, and it's we're a new team this year, so our goals are to grow. I think dropping our first series to League City helped a lot to kind of like wake everyone up and say, hey, we got to be locked in. It's not going to come as easy. We have a lot of younger players. We're trying to work into the system, get them used to playing kind of at that club level. or MLQ level. So really just trying to get better every series and learn along the way, and then, you know, analyze our film, clean things up, and, you know, be good contenders by championship. That's all we could really hope for.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us once again, Jackson. Good luck against San Antonio. Obviously, the North Division Championship is still up for grabs, and we'll see you in Howard County.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Have a good one.
Thanks. All right, so that is going to do it for us here on week 5 of MLQ Replay. Thank you all so much for joining us. Once again, thank you to Jackson for being our interviews this week. Thank you to Naresh and Jack for being the analysts and walking me through this, my debut from the hosting standpoint of MLQ Replay. We will be back, and by we, I mean Ethan, Jack, and Naresh next week. So